If you have ever worked with Unreal Splines, you might bring yourself to use the same shapes over and over and over again with every new spline that you kind of create. Maybe you keep coming back to a circle, coming back to a square, but you're starting with just whatever you had there originally in that blueprint. Well, I've created a system to just transfer shapes you've pre-built onto any spline you want and scale them accordingly afterwards to make your life a little easier with working splines. So let me show you. So for example, here's a basic little spline. There's nothing here. I can go ahead and extend it. And let's say I did all of this. And I'm like, oh crap, you know what? I really would love to get back to the default spline shape. Well, I've added in a reset button. It just puts it back to whatever it was originally. Maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you want a specific shape. By having a library of splines here in the content browser, for example, a circle shape, which if I open it is literally just a spline in a circle. There's nothing special here at all. I can go ahead and select it and select transfer. And now all of a sudden, this spline has become a circle. And I can change it to any one of these pre-made shapes that I want. And then if I want to, I can scale it. So I can put in any number here at 100% scale. Of course, it's not going to change anything. But let's say I want to scale it up to 120%. I can just hit set scale. And it's going to increase it by 20% every single time. And this works with everything. I can go ahead and transfer it to a circle, scale it up, or scale it down. And this will allow you to really quickly make a library of splines and then reuse that library on any blueprint you want that is utilizing splines. So let me show you how to get this set up for yourself so you can start expediting your workflow with splines. So to get started, I'm going to right click in my content browser and I'm going to search for editor utilities right over here and grab ourselves an editor utility widget. Now there's two different types of setups you can use. I'm going to go ahead and use a stack box so I can control this a little bit better. I'm going to call it EUW for editor utility widgets underscore spline manager. And then I'll go ahead and open it up. So here we are in a blank, basically widget interface. And so we want to start creating some buttons and some UI that will allow us to get all the functionality we need. So let's start with a button. I'm going to grab our editor utility button. I'm going to just drag it out here into the scene. And then I'm going to grab ourselves a text and I'm going to drag it onto the editor utility button so we can go ahead and just populate it right in here. Now, right away, I'm going to change it from being the full height here because I don't need to be the full height. And we do that here in the top right corner with our vertical alignment. Instead of going all the way to fill vertically on the right, I'm going to snap it to top align vertically. And now you can see we now have just the little box right here in the top left corner, which is what we want. So I'll go ahead and select our text and I'll rename this from text blocks to reset. This will be our reset button. So if we want to go back to whatever it was originally, we will press this button. And now we need a few other buttons. So I'll go ahead and select our editor utility button. And actually, before I duplicate this, I'm going to set it to be a variable and I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to call this button underscore reset. So that way it's automatically set and it is a variable. Now I'll go ahead and duplicate it twice. So we have effectively 3 reset buttons. And all we're going to change is on the second one, we'll select the text. And for this one, I'll say transfer. And for the last one, I'll say set scale for our text. Now, at the current moment, they're all kind of horizontally. I would like it to be vertically in my case. So what I can do is select the button reset and with it selected, right click, wrap with vertical box. This will just basically make the vertical box a parent of this and add it over here. So now if I take our other buttons and I drag them on top of the vertical box, you can see that they basically start filling in into the vertical box and now they're all part of it and so stacked right on top of each other. Now the buttons are still called reset, reset underscore 1, reset underscore 2. Let's go ahead and rename this. So if I select reset underscore 1, this is our transfer button. So I'm going to call this button underscore transfer. And the other one, I'll go ahead and call button underscore scale. All of these are already set as variables, so we're good to go. And the only thing we need left is an input field where we can use to set the scale width. And for that, we're going to need to grab an editor utility editable text box. I'm going to go ahead and click on this and drag it on top of the vertical box. And we'll add it kind of on the bottom. We don't want it on the bottom. We're going to probably put it right before the scale. So I'm going to click and drag it over. Now it is right before the scale. Excellent. In the text, I'll go ahead and put it in 100 by default. So that way we have it in here. And now I want to kind of format this a little bit. So here on the right side, under appearance, under text style font, we can change the font if we would like. For example, I can select Droid Sans Mono. We'll change the font a little bit. We can also make it a little bit bigger. Let's say 30. That seems a little bit better in terms of having this be about the same size as the other ones. And if I scroll down a little bit, down here, you'll see justification. And I want to just center it right in the center. So now you can see we now have a text field and we have all of our stuff set up. Now, this field does need to be a variable because we need to actually be able to modify this. So I'll go ahead and here in the top right, select is variable, and I'm going to give it a name. And this is going to be our input %. So we'll scale it based on this % input. You can, of course, reconfigure this later to be 0 to 1 if that is easier. I just made it based on the % because I found that to be a little bit simpler. But we're pretty much done with this. If we want to, we can go ahead and compile this and then run the utility widget. You can see we now have this menu and nothing happens. We can go ahead and type in here, but of course, nothing is configured. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to take this and I'm just going to pin it right here in the top right because this is just a convenient place for me. You can personally pin it wherever you'd like. And then it opens every time you open up your Unreal Editor, it'll be here automatically. So let's go ahead and get started with the graphs and getting the functionality in. So in the top right corner, if you go from designer to graph, you'll see a pretty familiar site if you've ever used blueprints. The only difference is here you have pre-construct, construct, and event tick. Now in our case, we don't really actually need any of these, so I'll go ahead and select all of them and press delete. And now in the left-hand side, you can see here's our buttons and our input % that we have made as variables. So what I'm going to do is select button reset, and then down below, I'm going to select on clicked, and this will create an event where when a button is clicked, we can go ahead and execute something. And I'll do the same thing for button scale and an on clicked event and a button transfer, another on click event. There we go. So now we have 3 buttons: reset, scale, and transfer. Now I'll go ahead and move transfer to the top. We'll start with that actually as our first one. So the way this is going to work for transferring is we're going to grab whatever you have selected in your actual content browser. We're going to grab the first thing. So this only works with one spline selected. If you select multiple, we'll still only use the first one you've selected. And then what we're going to do is basically spawn it into the world, copy all of its attributes, and then remove it from the world. I found that to be the easiest way because in the content browser, when you're selecting something, it is an object reference, but once it becomes in the world, it becomes an actor reference. So personally, I found it easiest to just spawn it and then delete it. And seeing as this is not a real-time thing, it is a application to be used in the editor during construction, I don't see any problems with this. So the way we do this, I'm going to right click and search for get selected assets. And that's all we want. We want to get selected assets, and we'll plug this into the transfer. And then we want to grab the first one. So I'm going to do get a copy, index 0, which is going to be our very first one. And then we want to spawn it. So I'm going to drag out of the get and search for spawn actor from object. And that is going to be our object to use. And we'll plug that spawn actor right in there. The location could be right at origin. That doesn't matter. The rotation also does not matter. This can all be left as default. But we then want to grab a reference to this. So I'm going to right click on the return value. I'm going to promote it to a variable. I'm going to call this spline actor reference. Now we need to do all the functionality here. Now this functionality that follows here will actually be reused in the button reset. So it's easiest if we just create this into a function. Now, because it's going to need an input of a spline actor reference, what I'm going to do is actually duplicate this, plug it in. I'm going to right click on the spline actor reference, and then I'm going to collapse to function. And then I'm going to call the function spawn, copy, then delete, because that's exactly what we're going to be doing. And this allows us to just automatically get that spline actor reference as an input into our function, making it nice and easy. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And here we are. We have our input, and I can actually delete this. We didn't actually need it. It was just there for that input automatic. So now this is assuming that we now are using the actor that's in the level. So from here, we can go and get the actual spline component. So get component by class, and the class type is going to be our spline component. Go ahead and select spline component. And so keep in mind, this assumes that you have only a singular spline component in it. If you have multiple, this will grab the first one. So if you have a setup where you're using multiple spline components, you might want to adjust this for your particular use case. And now with this component, I'll go ahead and promote this to a variable as well by right clicking, promote to variable. And this is going to be our spline reference. I'm going to plug this in. And now what I want to do is first make sure that this is actually valid, because if this is not a valid component, then the rest doesn't matter. We don't want to actually do anything. So from here, I'm going to drag out of spline ref and search for is valid. We want the question mark one. And assuming that it is valid, we will go ahead and continue with the rest. So what we want to do is get all of the information from the spline originally. We want to know the location of the points, the tangents of the points. Are they linear or are they actual curved points? We want to grab all of this information and store it, and then put that information onto the new thing that we want. So I'm going to grab our spline reference and get the number of spline points. So we'll get the total number of points, but this does not start at 0. This starts at 1, because if there's only 1 point, it is not returning an array of 0, it's returning an array of 1. So what you want to do is subtract 1 here because we're going to be using this in a for loop. So from the is valid, we'll drag out and search for loop. You want to go a regular for loop, not a for each loop. And the last index, we'll pipe in this -1 into it, like so. So now we'll go ahead through every single one of these points. And what we're going to do is store that information. We'll do that by grabbing our spline reference. And then we want to grab a get location and tangent at spline point. And we also want to get spline point type. So I'll grab both of these. And we want to pipe in our index into both of these. So I'll go pipe in our index into our point index in here and in down here. So now I want to store all of this information. So the easiest way for me to do that, I'm going to right click on location, promote it to a variable. I'll keep it called location and I'll go ahead and delete the set. Same with the tangent, promote to a variable, delete the set, and promote the return value here and delete the new variable. This way I can go here on the left for the variables, right click on the vector, and spline point type, and it'll convert them all to an arrays, which is what we want. We want to store them all in one go. Now this new variable, I'll go ahead and rename this. I'll just call this spline point type. Location and tangent can stay like so. But now what we can do is grab our location and grab our tangent and grab our spline point types. And from each one of these, I'm going to drag out an add node. So I'm going to add the location to our location array. I'm going to add our tangent to our tangent array. And I'm going to add our spline point type to our spline point array. So there we go. We have now stored the location, the tangents, and the spline point type of that original spline that we've spawned in. Excellent. So now that we have all this information, we want to get what is currently being selected in the level and apply that information to it. So out of completed, we want to actually start utilizing everything. So what I'm going to do is right click and search for editor actor subsystem. And we're going to just get the regular editor actor subsystem. And from here, I can drag out of here and get selected level actors. And this gets us everything that we have currently selected. And we'll plug this in from this completed right above. And for here, we can now go through everything. So I'll drag out the return value and do a for each loop. So for everything that we have in our level, let's start reassigning this information back to it. So the first thing we want to do is get the actual component like we did here. And we also want to check if it's valid. So I'll take both of these. I'll just duplicate it down here to make it easier myself. I'll plug in the array element into the component of class. And this is going to go into is valid. So assuming that it is valid and it does have a spline component, then we can go ahead and start assigning it. Now, I want to actually just promote this to a variable to make it a little bit easier for myself, but we only need this as a local variable. So I'm going to right click and promote to local variable. And I'm just going to call this local spline. And then we'll plug it in right before the is valid and plug the output of this into the input. Now, if you're unfamiliar with local variables, basically they're variables that exist only within the function. So as soon as the function finishes executing, the variable gets reset back to default. And in our case, we don't care about storing that information for the long term. We only care about it within this particular loop. So that's perfect. So assuming this variable is actually valid, let's get our spline reference. And we want to see if it is a closed loop. So I'm going to search for is closed loop. And now we have our bool to actually make sure that it is a closed loop. And now we need to set the actual new spline to be a closed loop according to the original. So what we can do is grab our local spline and drag out and search for set closed loop. And if it's valid, we'll go ahead and set it based on the original. So just go ahead and plug it in directly like so. Nice and simple. And now let's go ahead and set up all the rest of here. Now the location of the points, we can actually do all at once. So from here, I'll just duplicate it and I'm going to search for set spline points. And we can actually pipe in the location directly as an array, which makes it quite nice. I'll drag our location right on top of it and assign it. And we want to make sure that's still local because that is what we are actually saving them as. So we want to pipe things back in the same way. So we're doing it local originally, we're getting it. And so we're setting it back as local as well. Now the tangent, unfortunately, we cannot set in bulk. So instead we're going to do a simple for loop again. So I'm going to search for loop. And now we want to basically do the same thing we did over here with the get number of spline points and the -1. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to duplicate it down here. And into the spline point, we want to grab our local spline. So I'll go ahead and plug that in here. And this goes into our last index for our for loop. So this will now go through the new loop that we've selected in the level. With it, again, selecting the local spline, we're going to set tangent at spline point. the singular one. And you can see we get our point index and our in tangent. So in the loop body, we'll plug this in to set tangent at spline point. The index will go from the index. The in tangent, we need to grab from our tangent array. So I'll grab our tangent array, and I'm going to grab ourselves a get node. I'll get ourselves a reference, and I'll grab the reference at the index of the loop. And then we're going to plug that into in tangent. And the last thing we want to get is the actual spline point type, which we got before. So I'll grab that as well, get ourselves a get node again, and our index. And from our local spline, I'll go ahead and search for set spline point type. And just like the other one, we'll plug in our index to point index, and our type will be from the spline point type. So we're pretty much almost done with this. All we need to do now is delete the original actor. We don't need that spline reference anymore. We've now utilized it once it's gone through this loop as many times as you need. So I'll grab our spline actor reference, and I'm going to search for delete actor. So after it's all done, go ahead and delete it from the world. We do not need it anymore. So I'll go ahead and compile this. Now it is throwing us some errors and says can't parse default value. This happens because we converted to a singular before we transferred it to an array. So to get rid of this error, I say compile one more time and the errors all go away. This happens every time when you set a variable as regular single and then you convert it to an array later. It just is confused for just a moment when you have to recompile one more time and it goes away. So don't worry about that. But now already we can start testing this. So if I grab the spline here, which is just a regular spline, single line, nothing special about it. If I select this spline circle that we have and I hit transfer, you can see it has now become a circle. Now, none of the other buttons currently do anything, but the transfer now already works to transfer it to different things. But you can see when I transferred to the box, something weird happened. Why is it that we now have multiple things? Well, we haven't actually cleared the actual variables at the beginning, and we need to do that. So let's go back to our event graph. And at the very beginning, before we get all these actors, we want to actually clear all these variables that we're setting, because otherwise we keep adding to them, but we never actually remove them. So to make it easier on myself, I'll make a new function, and this is just going to be our clear variables function. And all I'm going to do is search for our location, our tangent, and our spline point type. And from each one, I'm going to just grab ourselves a clear, and I'm going to clear all three of these at the very beginning. And now in the event graph, I'll go ahead and just plug this in right at the start like so. So we've cleared it, and then we go ahead and grab all of our information that we need. So if we grab another spline point regular one, I'll go ahead and transfer in the circle. And now if I transfer in a square, you can see it remains to be just a square. It is not a square and a circle, because we are now resetting the points to where they are supposed to be. And if you guys are enjoying the tutorial so far, I would love to hit the like button and click subscribe while you're down there for more awesome tutorials like this. Let's get back to it. Now, if you did this for yourself and you're like, great, this is exactly what I wanted, let me just grab this and, oh no. What happens when I move it? It goes back to where it was before. Now, this is actually a very simple fix that just requires a simple checkbox on your blueprint. So here's my original blueprint. It just has a spline in this case. Nothing fancy about it. But in order for it to maintain that information, you will need to do this on any blueprint that has a spline that you're applying this information to. And all that is, select your spline, and in the detail panel, search for construction, and you want to select override construction script in your spline specifically. With this checked on, it will now maintain the changes. So we'll go ahead and compile this. And now if I go ahead and select the circle and hit transfer, you'll see it becomes a circle and I can move it. Everything maintains, nothing gets overwritten. So you just need to make sure that you have that override construction script checkbox turned on, and then all of this works. If you don't turn it on, unfortunately, it will get overwritten as soon as you update that spline. Now, I'm not sure why it is needed, assuming that we're not actually doing anything on the construction script to modify the spline. It just seems like it's one of those things that's needed for it to realize, oh yes, take the new information and then go with it. Don't maintain whatever we had before. So now let's go ahead and set up the reset button. The reset button will be similar to this. We'll go ahead and reuse the spawn, copy, and delete, and the clear variables. So let's grab the clear variables at the very beginning, right away. But this time, instead of getting the selected assets, we want to get the selected level assets. So I'm going to right click and search for get editor actor subsystem. And from here, I'm going to search for get selected level actors. We'll plug that in. And for each one, we just want to grab the first one. Now this one, I'm setting it up to just reset the first one you do. You could of course set it up to reset multiple, but I'll be showing you how to do it on just the first one. So from here, I'm going to get a copy, and this will be of index 0. So this is the first one you've selected for resetting. And then we want to get the component of class, get component by class, and The class, of course, is our spline component, and we want to make sure that it is valid. So from here, we're going to drag out and search for is valid and make sure that it is valid before we continue. Because again, if you're selecting something that does not have spline components, this should not do anything. Assuming this is valid, we want to spawn the actual class that our selection is. So from this get node, I'm going to drag out of here and search for get class. And now we can use this class to spawn actor from class. So dragging out of the get class, search for spawn actor from class. And if it's valid, we'll go ahead and spawn it. And again, it can be at 000. That is completely fine. And just like before, I'll go ahead and take the spline actor reference variable and the copy points and delete. I'm going to duplicate it over and just plug these in. It goes ahead and takes this and sets it. And then it goes ahead and copies all the information. And then, as before, it goes ahead and deletes it. So I'll go ahead and compile this. This is all it is for the, again, for the reset. And here we can go and have our circle selected, press the reset button, and you can see it goes back right to that original shape of just a simple spline. And if we look in our outliner, you can see no new things have actually stayed here. Every time it creates something, it goes ahead and deletes it right away, so you're not stuck with a bunch of extra nodes in the outliner either. Now, as always, this project will be available on my Patreon, where you can join these wonderful people here in supporting what I do. It really means a lot. And if you'd like to join the community, the link to the Discord will be down below, where you can join like-minded people like yourself. And again, thank you so much to my Patreons. Let's get back to it. And now for the final thing, let's go ahead and set up our scale. Now we're going to do some things just like the previous one. We're going to grab our clear variables. We're going to get our selected level actors, and we need to get the components of the class that they are, and we're going to be checking if it's valid. So I'll go select all of these, and I'm going to duplicate it down here and plug it in. So the difference being here is in this get selected level actors, we want to do a for each loop because we want to go through every single one of them. And for each one, we want to get the component and make sure it is the spline component. And here I'm going to go ahead and set this as a variable. So I'll go ahead and set it as the spline reference. We can just reuse the same variable as we had before, because when you do this, it goes ahead and just runs the current thing. They're not actually tied, so we can reuse the variables to make it easier on us. And we'll go ahead and test that it is a valid variable. So assuming it is valid and does have these spline components, well, we then want to get the information from our percent input, this guy right here. And we want to make sure that not only do you have an input selected, but it's actually greater than 0, because we don't want to scale it to 0, because that will kind of destroy everything. So we need to convert basically our text input into a float that we can use to multiply and adjust our scales of everything with. So what I'm going to do is here on the left, we'll grab our input percent. And now we're going to search for get text, which gets us the text that we have input into that field. Now we want to get this to be a float. Now we can get this text converted by going to string. You can see here under utilities to string text, and then you can go from string to float. You hear string to float, and now we have a float, and now we can check if this float is greater than 0. And so assuming you have some information in here and it is indeed greater than 0, then we can go ahead and make the adjustments in this. So assuming this is true, we'll go ahead and make a branch and plug in our condition. This will also automatically take care of a situation where you put nothing into that field. Because we have nothing into that field, it will return 0 by default. And so this makes sure that, hey, you do have something in the entry, and then we're good. So similar to before, I'll go ahead and grab our spline reference. We're going to get the number of spline points, and we're going to subtract 1 from them. And we do that because, again, the spline point starts at 1 and not 0, because we're going to be using them in a for loop. So we'll go ahead and grab ourselves a for loop and plug this -1 into our last index. And all we really need from this is to just store the spline point types from this. So I'll grab our spline point type, search for add. And now what we can do is get our spline reference and get spline point type. The index will be the point index, and the return value can go right into this linear field in here. And that is going to go into our add node. So we're going to go through everything and record all of our spline point types. When we scale the spline, we want to make sure that if it is a curved point versus a linear point, we want to maintain that. So whatever it is, it does not change the type. So once we have this, we kind of need to do another loop. So I'll go ahead and just take all of this, the spline point type and the for loop. I'm going to duplicate it, and I have that plugged in from the completed. The difference here is we're going to promote this index to a variable, and we'll just plug it in directly, because it'll just be easier than dragging it everywhere right after this. Let's get our spline reference, and we want to first set location at spline point. And for that, we're just going to plug this in. Now, the point index will be from our index, so we can just plug it in directly here since it's right next to it. Now, the in location, we need to grab from the actual location of the spline. So what we're going to do is grab our spline reference, and then I'm going to search for get location and tangent at spline point. The point index will be our index. It'll be local as before, but now we need to actually scale this. Now, because it's local, we can just actually multiply it. So from location, I'm going to search for multiply. And basically what we want to multiply is by this input. So just like before here, when we do the greater, I'm going to take all of this, just duplicate it over, and this float, we can go ahead and then divide by 100. So this returns me, instead of a 0 to 100 for a percent, it returns me a 0 to 1. Because at 100%, it is 1.0, so the scale doesn't change, which is exactly what we want. So now we go ahead and multiply by this vector. So I'm going to right-click on this vector for the second slot. I'm going to go to float. Single precision is fine. I'm going to plug this in through and take this in location and plug it into our set location spline. So it's going to go ahead and convert it based on this input percent. And we want to do the same thing with a tangent. So from the spline reference, I'm going to search for set tangent at spline point, plug it all the way through, and I'll go ahead and plug in our index into our point index. The in tangent will do the same thing. We'll just take this multiply and duplicate it over. Again, I'll plug this in here, plug the tangent in here, and now we can plug in this tangent all the way through. So now the tangents and the actual locations will be scaled accordingly. And the last thing we need to do is apply the spline point types that we had. So in the spline reference, I'll drag out and search for set spline point type, plug it in at the end here. The index will of course go into point index as before. And the type we get for a spline point type array, and we want to just go get ourselves a reference at the index that we have. And this output of the get node, we can plug into our type just like so. And now go ahead and compile this. And so now if I wanted to, we can already test the scale. Now it'll be a little difficult to see with this line, so I'll go ahead and transfer it to a circle. And now if I hit set scale, nothing happens because we're at 100%. But if we go 150 and then set scale, you can see it is now getting bigger. And if I make it smaller, let's say 50%, and select set scale, it is now getting smaller. And I, of course, can transfer it to a square. And again, transfer it to, let's say, 200% scale. And you can see it is maintaining the linear corners or the rounded corners, depending on the shape. And you, of course, can convert it to any shape you want, and it will maintain, as you can see. So hopefully this tool will now allow you to quickly create a library of different spline configurations and really quickly utilize those to place into whichever setup you have that utilizes splines. Now, again, don't forget to actually turn on the override constructor script on the spline of your main actual setup. So that way the actual configuration doesn't get lost as soon as you move it. Other than that, you should be good to go. If you're looking for another tool to help navigate the actual interface and make your workflow a little bit easier, check out this video here where I show you how to create a quick selection tool to help with your workflow.